You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 252 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Yeah, a few things I want to talk about in today's show, but I really want to highlight what I think the best method is to fight the wars in Congress. And then I want to discuss a article written by Turkish President Erdogan in Foreign Policy magazine about the UN and what he would like to see the UN become. So I think some pretty interesting stuff on today's show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com is the website for the show. You could also find all my work at libertarianinstitute.org, and right there on the Libertarian Institute's homepage, you can find my daily news roundup and this show under the Foreign Policy Focus space, and it's on the right-hand column in the show, right underneath the Scott Horton Show, which is also something everybody should be listening to if, you really like foreign policy or care about and want to end the wars and all, which is what I'm mostly talking about here first, and that is, what's the best way for Congress or to push, kind of the congressional effort to fight the wars? Because there's a couple different routes you could take here. One suggestion has been to pass a new authorization to use military force that would be much more limiting and would explicitly, say in there, this isn't a resolution to fight Assad. This isn't a resolution to fight the Houthis. This isn't a resolution to fight the Palestinians or Hezbollah or Al-Shabaab or the Taliban, but this is specifically a resolution to fight, let's say, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula or ISIS or something that they would hope would be more limiting. I think activists who have pushed, this kind of legislation often like to include, persons, places, or, named groups and no vague language in the bills. And so this is seen as one option to start to end the wars. The other one is by either invoking the Constitution or more likely the War Powers Act, which is kind of the law Congress passed over Nixon's veto to empower them in exercising their war-making or war-ending powers. And so this legislation would look like a bill that would be a privileged motion, I believe, because it is a part of the War Powers Act that any time a bill on the war powers, saying that we're looking to, either, I believe, even expand or limit the president's war-making powers, those motions are privileged and do get a vote. And so I think we've seen this in the past with a bill in the House and then a bill in the Senate. However, in some good news, we have a new House bill that's been offered. The name is H-Con Res 138. And what this bill does is it invokes the War Powers Act to end the United States' role, at least in ending the civil war against the Houthis. Well, I guess it's really not a civil war. And that's actually something I should talk about next. Ending the U.S. role in Yemen's war. So I actually had a listener of the show, a good guy who I know listens a lot, and I really appreciate his feedback, kind of comment and say I should stop using the word civil. I think especially when applying to Syria and Yemen, just because so many of the forces fighting in these wars are from outside of those countries. I think it's a fair criticism. My hesitation here is just that everybody uses not everybody, but I think most people, especially kind of in the mainstream and, what people would search for in the Google machine if they, want to get information on, let's say, Yemen, they would, I think, search the Yemen Civil War, not the Yemen War. But maybe I'm wrong about that. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do there, but I do recognize that by calling it the Yemeni Civil War, I do think it really downplays the role that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the United States have in that war. And I think it's probably just as critical as any of the actual warring parties on the ground in Yemen. I mean, especially just with the vast number of bombs that the United States and Saudi Arabia have dropped on that conflict and the blockade of the country that's really starving the Yemeni people, especially the children, to death. But back to the point of this discussion, and that is I'm really encouraged to see this bill in particular pop up because I think it's a much more effective way of fighting the wars abroad and the endless wars. one of the great things that could be put in a new AUMF would be a sunset clause. And this would be something that says that at the very least, Congress has to hold a vote every so many years to continue to reauthorize the war. Of course, this, would probably be set at a much shorter time frame than these authorizations to use military force are typically sent for. I mean, look, 2001 was 17 years ago now. And so that AUMF is 17 years old, yet we're still using it. So I think having a sunset clause would have forced the United States Congress to vote a couple of times between now and 2001 on continuing the Afghan war. The issue with that is that Congress so rarely decides to stop doing something and typically just continues, any of the programs. Even, let's say, after a massive and incredibly important and heroic leak by Edward Snowden to expose the mass surveillance program, and yet the Congress continues to reauthorize the Patriot Act, or in its new, same but mutated form, the USA Freedom Act. And so let's say that in 2012 or something, the Congress had put like a 10-year or past, a 5-year and then another 5-year AUMF for Afghanistan. I don't think necessarily that the Chelsea Manning Afghan war log leaks will have actually changed Congress's mind on the war. They would have said, yeah, we see how it's really bad, but that's kind of irrelevant to what we're doing now because now we're only killing the bad guys. The other issue with having, I think, the sunset clause in there is that it's something I'll talk about later in the show, but what we see with resolutions like the NDAA every year, which is the authorization and funding for the Pentagon and the defense budget, that they throw so much like new powers in these reauthorization bills that I think it's almost worse than, had we just like let it continue at its same pace as before. Famously the 2012 NDAA included a provision that allows the president to indefinitely detain American civilians. So, these things are a real problem. And anytime you have Congress doing stuff, it's usually not a very good thing for the freedoms of the people. So there's that. And also by passing legislation that authorizes the U.S. government to do things, I think it would be really difficult to actually have that mean anything to the U.S. government. I think what we've seen by the AUMFs that were passed in that the 2001 didn't say a whole lot. It, just said to go after Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and now we're using it to fight Al-Shabaab. We're using it to fight ISIS. I'm pretty sure that AUMF has been used more or less for the United States to wage the war in Yemen and Syria. So I don't know if there's like a AUMF that the Congress could possibly pass that would actually restrain the president's war-making power and what they're going to do with it, especially when the U.S. media does not do their job to expose how these wars have absolutely nothing to do with the authorization Congress passed in order to enforce them. Whereas the War Powers Act route really invokes the Constitution, which I think is something that just in the zeitgeist of the American culture, you really can't deny that, that there are war-making powers in the Constitution and Congress has the power to decide whether to go to war or not. And so if Congress starts invoking the War Powers Act for Yemen, for Syria, arguing that, at this point, Osama bin Laden is dead and the Taliban were removed from power back in 2002, that the AUMF of 2001 really doesn't apply anymore in Afghanistan. Certainly, if Congress really wanted to fight about it, they could argue that deployment of U.S. troops are violation of the War Powers Act without congressional approval. And so that could be critical to, say, ending drone wars, such as the one going on kind of in West Africa that's flown out of Niger and Cameroon. So I think this War Powers Act is the way to go. And I think it, just keep that in mind whenever you're looking at, supporting legislation, or if you ever have a chance to talk to one of our political overlords, to say, hey, look at doing this. I think the AUMF route is a bad one. And if we look to pass the AUMF, a new one, I'm guessing it's going to be something that tries to just authorize everything the United States is already doing, rather than actually limit what the United States government can do. I'm hoping that next week I'll have some analysis for everyone about the big UN Assembly meeting. I really haven't had a chance to go through that yet. I know Trump made a very hawkish speech against Iran there, and also was hawking it up against China a little bit. you had the U.S. flying some bombers near the South China Sea. Of course, this upsets China every time it happens. It's basically one of those territorial dispute things that the United States used to do a lot with North Korea. So maybe this is, the Trump administration trying to throw a bone to the Pentagon or the Air Force by, saying, well, you can't carry out these maneuvers anymore with North Korea because we're actually making diplomatic process there. But here, go stir the hornet's nest a little bit in China. Nobody really cares. Of course, there's an awful lot of Chinese people who really do care about this kind of thing. You also had Donald Trump saying that China placed propaganda in Iowa's newspaper. This is gonna get ridiculous and kind of scary, I think, especially as we approach the midterms in 2018, but probably even more so during the general election in 2020. And that's that everybody's gonna claim that every other country is propagandizing the United States. Because all these, it's a globally integrated world, and, different countries and companies put ads in U.S. papers to sell things. Certainly travel to China, travel here, travel to Zimbabwe, go to Mali or whatever other country. They advertise in U.S. papers, but then I'm sure that there are more covert things that may be going on. But, the U.S. seems to be now kind of complaining that China is carrying out a campaign of malign influence around the world. And it's almost like a replica of what the hashtag resistance types, the mainstream Democrats and the worst of the Republicans are out there saying about Russia, that the United States is now claiming about China. To some extent, it may be true, but at the end of the day, I really don't think you have to worry about Chinese propagandists changing the way Americans think. I think the bigger things going on within the U.S. are coming from, within our own culture and our own people. Mainly coming from, I think, the two-party establishment and the party elites who will do anything and destroy as much as they want to stay in power and, enrich their benefactors. I do want to mention again, and I know I've made this point on plenty of shows, but I think it's very important that we continue to see that the Korean peace is being driven by the Koreans. You had a very important meeting between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un. Of course, those are the president of South Korea and the supreme leader of North Korea, where Moon Jae-in traveled to North Korea. I think he ate some traditional North Korean food. So there was a lot of, good photo ops and stuff like that coming out from the event. You also had them traveling to a sacred Korean mountaintop volcano thing. But after the summit, you had the South Korean president coming out and saying that Kim Jong-un really is serious about denuclearization. I think this just goes to show, it proves the point that I've been trying to make so well, in that, what's going on in North Korea, as much as the American media and some people in the U.S. want to play politics about it and say, this is Trump propaganda and he's sucking up to the dictator. This is the Korean people, the people of North and South Korea, moving together. This is very widely supported within South Korea. We don't have polling information on North Korea, but I'm sure the North Koreans are probably favorable to any policy that stops them from starving. And, that's what kind of previous policy of hostility South Korea, the United States, and Japan versus North Korea produced, was that the North Koreans were poor and starving. And of course we know this because North Korean ships full of dead, starved to death people wash up in Japanese islands. Hopefully, Moon Jae-in isn't trying to really, maybe do propaganda himself by making these statements. I've never seen North Korea, Kim Jong-un say that, no, I didn't say that, because I think it would be disastrous if he was lying about this. And I hope he understands that. So I don't want to just take it on the face that I believe, world leaders at their word all the time. It's possible that Kim Jong-un or Moon Jae-in are trying to deceive each other, or the United States. But at the end of the day, if you look at kind of the motivations of these two men, it seems very unlikely that either would be motivated to lie in this situation. All right. Now I want to move on to the Turkish President Erdogan's article in Foreign Policy magazine. I'll link to it in the show notes page. Before I did this show, I actually, just Googled and, searched Erdogan UN, Turkey UN, to see if anything on this specific article came up. And I was very surprised to not see any commentary on it at all. It's not very long. It's probably worth just taking a look at and reading pretty quickly. in the article, Erdogan makes the argument that the world should save the UN, that the world needs to fix the UN, and explains why it's worth fixing. Now, just, I guess, to start out with his proposed fix, what he outlines in the article is that it needs to be accessible to more nations, and basically, the United States, China, the UK, France, and Russia run the thing, because they're the permanent UN Security Council members, and the Security Council members have all the power, and any permanent Security Council member can veto any, proposed UN resolution and kill it on the spot. And those are the only ones that really have like teeth as far as, things go in the world. So if you want to, condemn a leader or, put sanctions on anybody through the UN, you have to go through the United States Security Council. Erdogan is proposing to remove the status of permanent Security Council members and expand the Security Council to 20 seats. I think the current Security Council is actually 15 seats with 10 rotating members and then the 5 permanent members. I think this would be an absolutely radical change in world order. I see, the UN Security Council members as they currently sit being very unlikely to agree to this just because it would be a massive reduction in power for them. I mean, imagine being in the place of the United States, Russia, China, the UK, and France now, that if a resolution comes up to carry out an investigation that would have actual consequences, if, sanctions come up, you have the power to stop that. Absolutely. Even if all 190 whatever members say the opposite thing, you're able to stop the UN from actually taking any action. And so that's extremely powerful, especially, I'm not a fan of the UN. I don't believe in this world government nonsense. However, it exists, and it is more or less a world government that does have power and teeth to do things, and I think part of that is just kind of power that is believed the UN has, and so it has it because all of its members go along with it, and the UN may dissolve if a motion like this actually went through. The United States and maybe the UK, France, Russia, or China would leave the thing, and then it would kind of die or become pointless. So I don't see it as being super practical of a change. I could see maybe the Security Council expanding a few members if that were to appease these other countries. But I can't imagine that, the Big Five would give up their veto power. Erdogan says that we need this. Basically because terrible things happen, the UN does absolutely nothing about it. He complains specifically of the situation with Palestine, Bosnia, Syria, and Yemen. I guess it's significant that he included all these countries, Bosnia, of course, being a Muslim country. And, we're going back a few years now to think of that. Assad, I believe Erdogan still holds an Assad must go position. And so, his complaint about Syria, I think also includes some references in a later paragraph to world leaders using chemical weapons and nothing being done about it. Yemen, I think, is a very interesting choice to include in here. Turkey is a Sunni majority state, although I do think the brand of Sunni Islam that's practiced in a lot of Turkey is somewhat different than the brand of Islam practiced in Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. But complaining about Yemen and pointing out that the UN has failed in Yemen, I think is a condemnation of the United States, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, Palestine, calling out Palestine there is something that would, always upset the Israelis, and that being another regional power. Erdogan is very critical of Trump, especially pointing out where Trump has reduced U.S. funding for UN agencies. He specifically brings up the Palestinian Relief Agency, I'm sure in part because Turkey is going to be put in a position where they have to pick up some of the slack that the United States has created by no longer donating that money to the Palestinian refugees. But also, again, we see Erdogan more and more frequently kind of positioning himself as, I think, kind of the shepherd of the Palestinian refugees. And that it's really a group of people without any leadership, especially any significant leadership, to represent them on a global stage. I mean, you do have Abbas, who is a leader who's far overstayed his welcome and doesn't at least appear from my reading to be particularly popular with the Palestinian people. And he is, of course, the president kind of the Palestinians in the West Bank. And then you have Hamas, who is widely considered in the international order to be a terrorist organization, being kind of the controlling government of the Gaza part of Palestine. Not saying that I necessarily agree with that label completely, but that, is the situation for the Palestinians. It seems that at least Mohammed bin Salman and the new King Salman of Saudi Arabia are less concerned about, kind of supporting the Palestinians than in the past. And I know Iran has been very supportive of the Palestinians, but I believe there were some complications in the Syrian civil war, actually, in the side that a lot of Palestinians took there that caused some problems between them and Iran. The last point about the article I want to make is Turkey made specific mention of Germany as another country who, because of the 5 permanent Security Council members having so much power, is underrepresented at the UN. When I first read that, I was very shocked, as Turkey and Germany, I believe at one time, completely called off their diplomatic ties and were at odds, especially post-coup in Turkey. That would be July of 2016. Where each country was kind of criticizing each other, and Turkey was receiving some condemnation from a lot of different European countries, especially over Erdogan's mass imprisonment and layoffs, with that used as part of his emergency powers after the coup. However, I saw today that Erdogan's now meeting with Merkel, and so it seems that, there's probably been some back channel stuff and some preparations for this going on for a while now between Germany and Turkey, but that those two countries are at least diplomatically moving back closer together. I also think this is very important because we had the announcement of a vehicle between the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China that will facilitate payments to Iran as U.S. sanctions have begun to be placed on that country, and oil sanctions have already been placed on that country. Kind of the problem is the dollar is used as the world reserve currency, and our monetary systems are therefore able to really affect international trade with their sanctions. So even trade that goes on, let's say, between the EU and Iran is complicated by the U.S. sanctions. However, the creation of this vehicle does, I guess, take care of some problems as far as the actual payments go. Now, I think there's still a lot of issues here, and this isn't like a complete end run around the Iranian sanctions, but I do think it's something more than symbolic, and that there are some real practical effects that will happen from the creation of this vehicle. I think I've also seen it labeled a bank. I gotta talk to like some international finance guy to actually explain to me like the logistics of how this thing works. But in relation to the Erdogan article, Turkey is another country that desperately wants to keep trading with Iran, even after the U.S. sanctions take place, and Turkey has said so. There's also been some other diplomatic issues between the U.S. and Turkey, including the U.S. arming of the Syrian Kurds and the U.S. pastor detained in Turkey. And, I think all these things are just little developments and are further points in the story that we are seeing unfolding. And me and Will talked about this a little bit in Foreign Policy Focus 250, that, the other countries of the world, I think, are starting to look at doing things without directly involving the United States. And I think this article by Erdogan and then, these end runs around the U.S. sanctions on Iran show that, some countries are just kind of done taking the U.S. lead on every single issue. Somewhere I think this could be important is Venezuela, where the United States is, very hostile against Venezuela. There's a lot of negative rhetoric coming from the Trump administration about Venezuela. You always have these reports, every few months, either in the Washington Post or New York Times, that Trump is like, wanting to plot a coup against Maduro or wants to, deploy troops to Venezuela or something like that. No doubt what's going on in Venezuela is a terrible thing, and Maduro is, at least in part faulted for the suffering and poor conditions of the Venezuelan people. However, the continued U.S. pressure and sanctions on Venezuela aren't going to help. The United States recently sanctioned Maduro's wife, as well as 6 members of his inner circle. it may seem like a good thing that, a bunch of commie lackeys are getting sanctioned by the United States and will hopefully, become a little bit less rich. I think the problem is that, if you ever want to start a process with Maduro or the Venezuelan government to normalize relations between our two countries, then you're going to have to start repealing some of these sanctions to, let's say, allow trusted members of Maduro's inner circle that he trusts travel to the United States. And we saw recently that, Rand Paul was trying to get some sanctions lifted against Russia, and the Congress blocked it like 20-1 was the committee vote on it. And so it's very unpopular among the Congress to remove sanctions. And so once you slap these sanctions on all these people, and then, let's say 3-4 years from now, the United States is looking to, start to maybe warm relations with the Venezuelan government, it's just going to be made more difficult by all these sanctions against all these top members of the Maduro regime. And not that, these are great people. And I think that, I don't think that U.S. companies should do anything, to enrich these people. But at the same time, when we're looking at it as, Trump may decide one day to invade Venezuela, any, communication options that are possible are preferable. And, we're going to need these kind of things, and sanctions are just going to get in the way of that. And then, of course, there's the economic issue that these guys probably own businesses in Venezuela, what little ownership there is, or maybe are like commissioners or controllers of different departments. And so, if they can't operate their departments, it's going to slow it down and, in some ways may hurt the Venezuelan government. But at the same time, the people are always the most affected, and they're the ones that are going to end up starving to death and becoming impoverished. So, always reject sanctions is kind of my philosophy of it. All right, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. If you like the show and you really want to support, I appreciate if you think about donating on Patreon, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I want to give a huge shout out, and I should have done this earlier, to the Around the Empire podcast. Joanne Leone had me and Will Porter on the phone. We were on the show, we recorded for a few hours. It's probably like a 4-hour total, 3-part series on former CIA director John Brennan. I think it's absolutely great. I think Will and Joanne did a really terrific job. And, I hopefully contributed some, to like kind of going through the past scandals of John Brennan, somebody who's really a terrible figure and was involved in a lot of the worst things the United States government has done since the fall of the Soviet Union. So check that out and, share my stuff. Kyle, Kyaale on Twitter, Libertarian Union on Facebook.